Now, let's look at some of the key techniques and guidelines applicable to this phase. We spoke earlier about principles briefly. We will spend time in this section to understand architecture principles better. So, what exactly are enterprise architecture principles? Well, before we dive into that, let me reiterate partly the definition of enterprise architecture according to TOGAF, which reads as follows. Architecture is the structure of components, their interrelationships, and the principles and guidelines governing their design and evolution over time. You might have already got from this definition that the principles and guidelines form a key aspect of what enterprise architecture is, and that they govern how the components of the architecture is put together, as well as it also determines how this design is allowed to evolve over time. Architecture principles are used to constrain architectural choices, thereby consistently promoting the best interest of the organization across various architecture and solution development initiatives. They have the net effect of increased order and consistency, while simultaneously reducing complexity and cost. By the way, who creates these principles? Well, the principles are typically developed by enterprise architects and are blessed by key business stakeholders and the architecture board. And the architecture board typically includes a CXO whom the enterprise architecture function reports into. In general, in early stages of an enterprise architecture team's life cycle, these principles are identified based on the expert opinions of enterprise architects involved and also based on the agreement of other stakeholders to these principles. It is not entirely uncommon for an enterprise to adopt generally understood principles applied across specific industry of the enterprise or from other related industries. Principles are usually enduring. However, they need to be periodically reviewed to keep the enterprise architecture practice relevant to the organization's current context. So, in effect, as the enterprise architecture practice evolves, the principles should evolve based on the collective experience of the organization. Now, let's look at what a principle might look like. TOGAF recommends the following template while defining principles. The template is as follows. It includes principle name, statement of the principle, rationale, and implications. The principle name is an unambiguous and a memorable name that captures the essence of the principle. And the statement should succinctly and clearly articulate the principle. The rationale is the part of the principle which describes the reason why the principle need to be employed in terms of business benefits for the organization, and also cross-reference other supporting or related principles. Implications is that part of the principle which clarifies the consequence to the business as well as to the IT organization when the principles are applied correctly and elaborates how it will impact the status quo of the enterprise. It is important to not oversimplify or trivialize the implications, even though in certain cases the consequences may only be speculative. And here is an example of the enterprise architecture principle. I will stop speaking for some time to allow you to quickly glance through this example. And finally, I feel it is important to clarify this question. Are architecture principles set in stone? We just briefly covered this a while ago, but let me elaborate on this a bit more. The short answer is no. They can and should be altered to be relevant to the enterprise's context. That said, I don't mean that to imply that architecture principles can be modified whimsically. Within the scope of a given architecture initiative, enterprise architects who are engaged in that work should determine the set of architecture principles that are core for the initiative and also communicate clearly what the implication of the principles are for that initiative. In certain instances, the principles may not be updated to reflect the current business reality, or it may not be pragmatic to employ a strict implementation of these principles. And it is the architect's responsibility to disambiguate, update, or enhance the principles in question to make it relevant and pragmatic. It is not entirely uncommon to have principles which, when applied to a given context, can potentially contradict or oppose each other. For example, say you have two principles which are named, say, boundless information flow, and another one which stands for secure by default. Here again, it is important for the architect to take leadership in interpreting these principles pragmatically for the context and to offer guidance on striking the right balance and trade-off. We discussed the architecture principles in this section because it constituted the key guidelines and techniques relevant for this phase. The next aspect that is helpful to know about the preliminary phase is probably a summary of the set of inputs and outputs relevant for this phase. So, what inputs are required to initiate the preliminary phase? Well, to successfully run the preliminary phase of architecture development method, you need to know what the strategic objectives of the business are, as well as you need to understand the business drivers, goals, and principles. This phase also requires to know the existing enterprise frameworks which the architecture development process need to accommodate. These will help establish the context of the enterprise. With rare exceptions, a given iteration of ADM is unlikely to be the first ever architecture initiative undertaken by the enterprise. Hence, it is useful and handy to know information such as how the organization is structured, how the architecture team is structured if an enterprise architecture team already exists, for example. Any architecture framework or process that are previously used by the enterprise will also be quite handy. Any architecture principles that have been established earlier and is current enough to be reused will be quite handy as well. Any other architectural artifacts that are already in place will be very helpful. Now, in terms of outputs, the preliminary phase summarizes the findings from the analysis of this phase in an official deliverable called the Request for Architecture Work. The Request for Architecture Work typically incorporates the enterprise's current context, the need for architecture effort. It will represent the high-level view of the target state architecture, how the enterprise architecture team will run with the ADM iteration, how the architecture outcomes will be governed and managed as more detailed oriented ADM iterations are spawned, as well as how the architecture team would be guiding the implementation, deployment, and change management teams as the architecture is taken to implementation and embedded into the business. It will also incorporate the key principles and how principles need to be interpreted for the context of the current scope of work. And it includes the plan for tailoring TOGAF framework, which will incorporate information such as how the architecture development process will work alongside other existing enterprise frameworks, how the ADM iterations are planned, the scope of each iterations, and so forth. It is worth noting that the Request for Architecture Work can be used as a tool to drive consensus across various stakeholders. With that, by the way, we conclude our discussion of the preliminary phase, and next we will quickly look at architecture vision phase.